The British Empire controlled the roads. They held the towns. They garrisoned the rivers. On every map that existed in 1780, South Carolina belonged to Britain. But maps don't show swamps. They don't show the men who grew up inside them. And they don't show what happens when a 50-year-old farmer decides that the most powerful army on earth is going to have to come find him, in the dark, on ground it has never walked, against an enemy it cannot see, cannot catch, and cannot understand. The British didn't lose South Carolina because they were outgunned. They lost it because Francis Marion turned the land itself into a weapon, and they never figured out how to fight the ground. This story is not about a man. It is about a place. Specifically, about what happens when the people who know a place intimately decide to use that knowledge against an occupying force that does not, and cannot, know it the same way. The swamps and rivers and pine forests of the South Carolina Lowcountry were not simply the setting of Francis Marion's campaign. They were his army, his supply line, his intelligence network, his fortress, his escape route, his greatest tactical advantage, and the one thing the British had no framework to counter. Marion understood something that the British High Command never fully grasped. That terrain is not neutral. That geography favors the people who know it. That an army which controls the roads controls nothing if the enemy moves through the swamps that the roads were built to avoid. Before we go any further, subscribe right now if you are not already here, because this video is not another biography of a forgotten revolutionary hero. This is a story about how geography, local knowledge, and the refusal to fight on the enemy's terms can defeat an empire that has every conventional advantage. And that lesson is older than the American Revolution and more relevant than most military history YouTube will ever tell you. To understand Marion's campaign, you first have to understand the physical world he fought in. South Carolina in 1780 was not the tidy landscape of roads and farms that British commanders had mapped from their headquarters in Charleston. It was one of the most geographically complex theaters of the entire war, a landscape that changed character dramatically as you moved from the coast inland, and that held within it a series of natural features that the British Army, trained for European battlefields, was fundamentally unprepared to navigate. The Lowcountry along the coast was a world of tidal rivers, cypress swamps, and blackwater creeks that moved slowly through dense vegetation and offered almost no firm ground for miles in any direction. The water was dark, stained by the tannins from cypress roots and fallen leaves, and in summer it steamed with humidity and hosted clouds of mosquitoes that carried diseases the Europeans had no immunity to. The trails through this landscape were known only to the people who had walked them for decades. A stranger who stepped off a known path could sink to his waist in mud within a few yards. Moving north and west into the PD River country, the landscape shifted into a tangle of rivers, floodplains, and raised ground that functioned like a natural maze. Dozens of crossings, hundreds of trails, and a local population that had spent generations learning which routes were passable, at which water levels, and at what times of year. The backcountry further west was pine forest and red clay hills, where the roads were few and the distances between settlements were vast enough to make coordinated military operations across large areas almost impossible for any force that lacked local guides. The British controlled the coastal cities. They built their fortified outpost network in the backcountry. They garrisoned the bridges and the ferries, but they could not garrison the swamps. And the swamps were everywhere. Francis Marion was born around 1732 in St. John's Parish, South Carolina, into a family of Huguenot descent that had been in the colony for 2 generations. He grew up in the Lowcountry, fishing its creeks, hunting its forests, learning the specific texture of a landscape that most people who did not grow up in it found impenetrable and hostile. He was small, genuinely small, by the accounts of people who knew him, barely 5 feet tall, slight in build, with dark eyes, and a complexion weathered by decades outdoors. He walked with a limp from an ankle injury sustained years before the war. The same ankle, some accounts say, broken when he jumped from a second-story window at a Charleston dinner party in 1779 to avoid an evening of enforced drinking. A story that is either exactly true or exactly the kind of story that attaches itself to a man whose character it perfectly captures. He had fought the Cherokee in the 1750s and 1760s as part of the South Carolina provincial forces, campaigns in the upcountry forests that taught him something about fighting in terrain that does not conform to European military convention. He had watched British regulars struggle in those forests, their linear tactics and their parade ground discipline becoming liabilities in dense woodland, where visibility was measured in yards, not hundreds of yards. He had filed that lesson away for 20 years. What Marion had that British commanders did not, and could not acquire, was not simply knowledge of the terrain, it was relationship with it. A Scotsman from Edinburgh, who spent a year studying maps of the South Carolina Low Country, would know where the rivers ran. He would not know where the ground was firm after 3 days of rain. He would not know which creek crossings were passable at high tide, and which were not. He would not know which farms had been abandoned and which were still occupied. He would not know which families could be trusted and which had loyalist sympathies. He would not know the specific acoustic properties of the cypress swamps at night, the way sound traveled across still water, the way a patrol could be heard long before it was seen. Marion knew all of it. And he understood, from the moment he began his campaign in the summer of 1780, that this knowledge was the most valuable military asset he possessed, more valuable than numbers, more valuable than artillery, more valuable than formal training or official rank. The swamp was his weapon. He just had to learn how to aim it. Before Marion could use the terrain against the British, he needed to build something that would let him know where the British were. He built it from the landscape itself. The intelligence network Marion constructed across the South Carolina Low Country was not a formal espionage apparatus with handlers and dead drops and coded messages. It was something rougher and more organic, a web of relationships built on trust, family connection, and the shared knowledge of a community that knew its own ground. Farmers who lived along the roads watched British patrols and reported their movements to neighbors, who reported to other neighbors, who eventually reached Marion's men. Women, who could move more freely than men, who were questioned less and suspected later, carried messages between households under the cover of ordinary domestic activity. Enslaved people who worked in British garrison towns observed troop movements and supply deliveries and found ways to pass that information to the resistance network. Fishermen on the rivers noted the movement of flatboats and reported back. None of this required a single piece of paper. Most of it was oral, a message that existed only in memory and was never written down, could not be intercepted, deciphered, or used to identify sources. The British could arrest a suspect and find nothing, because there was nothing to find. This network was not Marion's invention. It was the natural communication system of a rural community that had been talking to itself across creeks and forest trails for generations. Marion did not create it. He tapped into it, treating the local population not as a resource to be exploited, but as partners whose knowledge and trust were essential to the campaign. That distinction mattered enormously. Where the British and their loyalist allies extracted food, supplies, labor, loyalty at the point of a bayonet, Marion and his men paid when they could, took only what was offered, and treated the families who helped them with the respect of men who understood they were guests in someone else's landscape. Cornwallis's strategy for the interior assumed that loyalist sympathy could be activated by military presence. What it found instead was that military presence without trust, particularly when that presence included the kind of extraction and intimidation that characterized some British and Loyalist militia operations, actively created the resistance it was trying to suppress. Every farm family that watched a Loyalist militia unit burn a neighbor's barn, confiscate livestock, or assault a civilian who refused to swear loyalty to the crown was a farm family that quietly added a node to Marion's intelligence network. The British were building Marion's army for him, one atrocity at a time. Marion's tactical approach was built entirely around the terrain's natural properties. He struck at dawn and dusk, the transitional light that made visibility poor and made it impossible to determine the size of an attacking force. A dozen men emerging from tree line in the half-dark of dawn, firing and screaming, could convince a garrison of twice their number that they faced a large organized force. He hit targets and disappeared before any organized response was possible. Not because his men were faster than British cavalry, they were often not, but because they were moving through terrain where British cavalry could not effectively pursue. A horse at full gallop cannot follow a trail that turns immediately into a swamp crossing. A formed infantry unit cannot maintain its organization moving through dense cypress forest in the dark. Marion's men dismounted and led their horses through the worst ground rather than riding. They knew which roots to step on, and which mud was stable, and which would take a foot to the ankle. They knew where the ground firmed up on the other side of a creek, and where it stayed soft for half a mile. They moved through landscape that British pursuers found effectively impassable. The signature of every Marion raid was the approach, the strike, and the dissolution. The approach, quiet, through the swamp, from an unexpected direction, at a time chosen specifically because it was the moment the garrison would be least alert. The strike, fast, loud, overwhelming, in the first seconds, targeting the specific objective, prisoners freed, supplies destroyed, dispatches captured, Loyalist muster broken up, and then immediately ending. The dissolution, Marion's force, splitting into smaller groups the moment the raid concluded, each group peeling off toward a different swamp crossing, moving to separate pre-arranged rendezvous points miles apart, reconverging only when the pursuit had exhausted itself or given up. The British could follow one group. They could not follow 6 simultaneously, and each group, moving through terrain its members had known since childhood, left no trail that a foreign army could read. Snow's Island, a raised piece of ground surrounded by the PD River and its tributaries, became Marion's primary base. It was accessible by a handful of routes that his men knew, and the British did not. The river crossings that led to it were navigable only in specific conditions that required local knowledge to use. The island itself was invisible from any surrounding high ground. You could search the PD country for weeks and never find it if you did not already know where it was. The British searched for it for months. They found it eventually, but by then Marion had already moved. To understand why Marion's geographic strategy worked so completely, you have to spend time with the man the British sent to stop him. Banastre Tarleton was 26 years old, the most feared cavalry commander in the South, and a man whose entire military philosophy was built on one principle: speed and aggression defeat hesitation and defense every time. He had made that principle work everywhere he had applied it. He had shattered continental formations at the Waxhaws. He had run down rebel forces across the Carolinas with a consistency that made him appear unstoppable. He was brave, physically imposing, and absolutely certain that the way to end any military problem was to find the enemy and destroy them before they could organize a response. His private conviction, which he expressed in letters and in conversation, was that the rebel partisans operating in the South Carolina swamps were not a serious military threat. They were bandits, farmers with guns who had gotten above themselves. A show of professional force, vigorously applied, would scatter them the way it had scattered every other American force he had encountered. He had never fought in a swamp. He had never chased an enemy who chose the ground, knew the ground, and used the ground as the primary weapon of the campaign. In November of 1780, Tarleton was sent after Marion with a substantial force of cavalry and infantry, enough to destroy any conventional American force of comparable size. He pursued Marion's band through the PD swamps for 25 miles without closing the distance by a single yard. The swamp that Marion's men moved through like water moved through Marion's men like stone, or rather, it did not move through them at all. Tarleton's horses struggled in terrain that offered no firm footing. His infantry lost formation in vegetation so dense that visual contact between men 15 feet apart was unreliable. His supply arrangements, designed for road movement, became useless when the roads disappeared into mud and cypress water. After 25 miles, Tarleton gave up. He reportedly turned to one of his officers and said he would not go any further into that damn swamp to catch that damn swamp fox. He had meant the phrase as an insult. It became one of the most recognizable nicknames in American military history. The British could not beat Marion because they could not find Marion, and they could not find Marion because the ground itself was hiding him, and the ground was fighting for the side that understood it. Here is the thing about Marion's campaign that most accounts underemphasize. The swamp was essential. The local knowledge was essential. The guerrilla tactics were essential. But none of it worked without the people. The network of farmers and women and fishermen and enslaved people who fed Marion information, who sheltered his wounded, who guided his men through the most treacherous ground, who warned him of approaching British columns with hours to spare. That network was the actual foundation of the entire campaign. And the British response to that network was the thing that guaranteed their failure. The loyalist militias that the British relied on to police the interior were brutal, in ways that the British regular commanders sometimes deplored, but rarely restrained. Farm families who were suspected of supporting Marion, which increasingly meant any farm family that had a young man not visibly serving with the Loyalists, faced confiscation of livestock and crops, destruction of property, physical intimidation, and in some cases worse. Each of these actions had the same effect. It took a population that might have been neutral and made it actively hostile. It took families who had been feeding information to Marion's network and turned them into families who were willing to do more. It converted sympathy into recruitment. It turned the Low Countries population into a weapon that replaced Marion's losses, extended his intelligence reach, and made the British occupation less sustainable with each passing month. The British were not just fighting Marion. They were fighting a landscape animated by the people who lived inside it. And you cannot defeat that by winning battles. You can only defeat it by winning the trust of those people. And the British, whose strategy for loyalty ran through coercion rather than consent, had made that impossible before Marion ever fired a shot. Marion's campaign did not produce the kind of victories that appear in dispatches. There was no Saratoga, no cowpens, no moment when a British army surrendered and the balance of the war visibly tilted. What it produced was something harder to measure and more consequential. It produced time. Every week that Marion's brigade operated in the South Carolina interior was a week that British forces had to allocate soldiers to protecting supply convoys, garrisoning outposts against raid, and chasing a force that could not be caught. Every dispatch rider who was intercepted was information Cornwallis needed and did not get. Every loyalist muster that was broken up before it could form into a fighting unit was manpower the British counted on and could not deploy. Marion never had more than a few hundred men at any given time. The British had thousands in the South Carolina theater. And yet Marion's few hundred tied down the British thousands in ways that a conventional force 10 times his size could not have accomplished. The cost is the point. The same cost that Nathaniel Greene was extracting from Cornwallis through battle, Marion was extracting from the British garrison system through geography. The two campaigns were not separate, they were complementary, one wearing at the British from the battlefield, one wearing at them from the landscape. By the time Cornwallis abandoned the Carolina interior and marched toward Virginia, toward the trap at Yorktown, the British position in South Carolina had been hollowed out, not through defeats in major engagements, through the slow, patient, grinding cost of trying to control a landscape that had decided it would not be controlled. Marion did not chase the British out of South Carolina. He made South Carolina itself chase them out. The swamp was the weapon. The British never learned how to fight the ground. The war ended. Marion went home. He returned to his plantation, Pond Bluff, on the Santee River, and tried to rebuild what the war had consumed. The plantation had been raided and damaged. His resources were limited. He was 50 years old. He served in the South Carolina State Senate for years, representing the same communities whose trust had made his campaign possible. He was a quiet legislator by most accounts, not a powerful political figure, not a man who dominated the chamber with oratory, or commanded the attention that his wartime reputation might have generated. He married in 1786, at the age of 54, a cousin named Mary Esther Vidot. They had no children. He died in February of 1795 at Pond Bluff, at the age of 63, surrounded by the Santee River landscape he had used as a weapon and then returned to as a home. His reputation faded almost immediately after his death. He received no national monument. No state capital was named for him. The men who had served under him scattered back to their farms and their families and their ordinary lives, and the extraordinary thing they had done together faded into local memory rather than national legend. What kept Marion's name alive for the next century was not military history, but fiction. Mason Weems, the same man who invented the story of Washington and the cherry tree, wrote a biography of Marion in 1809 that was more romance than history, a swashbuckling tale of a legendary partisan that captured the imagination of a young nation even as it buried the specific strategic sophistication that made the real campaign remarkable. The Swamp Fox became a legend. The strategy that made him effective remained, for most of American history, underappreciated. Snow's Island today is largely reclaimed by the swamp. The PD River has shifted its course in places. The specific routes Marion used are mostly gone, absorbed back into the landscape that generated them. You can visit a state heritage site near Johnsonville, South Carolina, where a small monument stands among the cypress trees. Most people drive past it without stopping. The swamp does not look like a battlefield. That was always the point. Here is the question this story keeps raising. Marion's strategy depended on two things that were specific to this landscape and this population: the terrain that the British could not navigate, and the local trust that the British could not acquire. Could Marion's approach have worked anywhere else? Could it have worked without the swamps, without the natural barriers that made pursuit impossible and concealment absolute? And could it have worked without the trust of the low country population, without the farmers and women and enslaved people who fed him information the British never knew he had? The answer is probably no to both, which means Marion's campaign was not simply a tactical template that could be imported anywhere. It was a response uniquely fitted to a specific place and a specific failure of imperial policy. The British could have won the trust of the South Carolina population. They chose coercion instead. The British could have learned to fight the low country terrain. They chose to ignore it instead. Marion did not defeat them. Their own choices defeated them. Marion simply had the intelligence to recognize what those choices were making possible, and the patience to wait in the swamp until the British had created the conditions for their own defeat. Drop a comment below. Do you think Marion's campaign could have worked without the geographic advantage of the South Carolina swamps? Or was the terrain the essential ingredient that made everything else possible? If this story changed how you think about what makes a landscape into a weapon, share it. Not for the channel, for the idea. Subscribe if you are not already here, because next time we are covering another campaign where the terrain itself decided the outcome, and the commander who figured that out before his enemy did. The swamp is just where this one happened.